They mistook your silence for permanence, as if the absence of your voice meant the absence of your thoughts. They observed your restraint and concluded that it was your nature, not realizing it was a decision, one shaped by awareness, by calculation, by a quiet weighing of consequences. To them, your stillness appeared as agreement, your patience as acceptance, your quiet as loyalty. They did not consider that silence can be a space where conflicts are contained, where unspoken truths gather density, where the mind continues to move even when the lips do not. Silence, in its deeper form, is never empty. It is filled with observation, with interpretation, with the slow construction of meaning. While they spoke freely, assuming the terrain was stable, you were mapping the unseen. Every word, every gesture, every contradiction was being absorbed, not reacted to but understood, and this understanding required distance, a step back from immediate expression. They interpreted that distance as passivity, failing to grasp that it was, in fact, a form of engagement far more intense than outward reaction. There is a peculiar tendency in human perception to equate what is visible with what is real. If something does not announce itself, it is assumed not to exist. Your silence fell into this blind spot. It became, in their minds, a constant, something reliable, something unchanging. They built expectations upon it, structured their behavior around it, and slowly came to depend on it. The less you spoke, the more certain they became that you would not speak at all. But silence is not a fixed state. It is a phase. It carries within it a tension, like a held breath, like a thought not yet completed. Over time, what is contained within it grows more complex, more insistent. The unexpressed does not dissipate, it organizes itself. Patterns emerge, connections form, and what once seemed tolerable begins to reveal its deeper implications. What you once allowed without comment begins to take on weight, significance, consequence. They did not perceive this accumulation. To them, each moment stood alone, disconnected from the last. They saw no continuity in your experience, no progression toward a threshold, and so they assumed there was no threshold at all. Your silence became, in their understanding, a confirmation that everything was as it should be. Yet beneath that surface, a process was unfolding, one that required no external acknowledgement to continue. The mind does not cease its activity because it is unspoken. It refines, it questions, it reevaluates. It begins to distinguish between what is endured and what is accepted, between what is temporary and what is defining, and in that distinction lies the beginning of change. What they called permanence was only a pause, extended long enough to appear stable, but never meant to last. You were evolving beneath their expectations, in ways too subtle to be immediately perceived and too complex to be easily understood. While they related to the version of you they had already defined, something within you refused to remain static. Growth rarely announces itself in visible shifts. It begins in tension, in quiet dissatisfaction, in the sense that something no longer aligns as it once did. They saw continuity, but within you there was movement, slow, deliberate, and often invisible. Expectations have a peculiar rigidity. Once someone believes they understand you, they stop looking. They engage not with who you are becoming, but with who you have been. Their perception freezes you in a moment that no longer exists, and they begin to interact with that frozen image as though it were alive. Meanwhile, your inner world continues to change, shaped by experiences they may never notice, by realizations you never fully express, by contradictions you quietly reconcile. This creates a divergence, subtle at first, almost imperceptible. On the surface, everything appears consistent. You respond, you participate, you fulfill roles that have been assigned or assumed, but internally, something begins to shift. You start to question what once felt certain. You notice patterns that once went unexamined. You become aware of the distance between what is expected of you and what feels true to you. This awareness does not erupt suddenly. It accumulates, layer by layer, until it begins to alter the way you see everything. They continue to measure you against an outdated understanding. Every action you take is interpreted through the lens of who you used to be. Even your changes are filtered, minimized, or misunderstood to fit their existing narrative. And because your evolution does not conform to their expectations, it becomes easy for them to ignore it altogether. What does not fit their image of you is dismissed as temporary, insignificant, or out of character. But evolution does not require recognition to proceed. It operates independently of perception. Beneath the surface, your thoughts become more refined, your boundaries more defined, your sense of self more distinct. You begin to differentiate between what belongs to you and what has been imposed upon you. The roles you once inhabited without resistance begin to feel restrictive, not because they have changed, but because you have. There is a quiet reorganization taking place. Priorities shift, tolerances narrow. What once seemed acceptable begins to feel unnecessary or even damaging. You do not always express these realizations immediately, not because they lack importance, but because they are still forming. Growth often requires a period of internal consolidation, where understanding deepens before it becomes visible. To them, nothing appears different. You are still present, still recognizable, still fulfilling expectations in ways that suggest continuity. But beneath that appearance, the foundation is changing. The assumptions they rely on are slowly losing their accuracy, even as they continue to trust them. They believe they know you because they once did, unaware that knowledge, when left unexamined, becomes outdated, and what they take as consistency is simply their inability to perceive the quiet transformation unfolding beneath their expectations. Suppression only strengthens the true self, not by diminishing it, but by forcing it inward, where it begins to consolidate its power. What is pushed down does not vanish. It changes form. It becomes less visible, less accessible to immediate awareness, but far more concentrated. Each time something essential is withheld, an emotion unexpressed, a thought left unspoken, a boundary ignored, it does not dissolve into nothingness. It settles deeper, accumulating weight, gathering intensity in a place beyond direct observation. There is a misconception that control over oneself is achieved through denial, that by refusing expression, one gains mastery. But what is denied does not submit, it waits. It reorganizes itself beneath the surface, forming connections that would not exist had it been allowed to flow freely. In this hidden space, it becomes more complex, more defined, less influenced by external expectations. What was once diffuse and uncertain begins to take on clarity, not in spite of suppression, but because of it. At first, this process is subtle. The suppressed elements remain fragmented, appearing only in fleeting moments, in sudden reactions, in dreams, in quiet dissatisfaction that seems disproportionate to its cause. These are often dismissed, explained away, or further suppressed, reinforcing the belief that they can be controlled indefinitely. But suppression is not resolution, it is postponement, and postponement allows time for accumulation. Over time, the inner pressure increases. The fragments begin to cohere, forming a more unified presence. What was once a collection of isolated impulses becomes something more structured, more persistent. It begins to assert itself in ways that are harder to ignore, not as chaos but as insistence. The individual starts to feel a growing tension between the life being lived and the truth that has been contained. This tension is not accidental. It is the natural consequence of prolonged suppression. The more energy required to maintain the suppression, the more energy is transferred to what is being suppressed. It becomes charged, infused with significance, shaped by everything that has been denied to it. In this way, the true self is not weakened by repression, it is intensified. It develops a kind of autonomy, existing almost independently from the persona presented to the outside world. Eventually, a point is reached where the effort to contain it becomes unsustainable. The structures that once held it in place begin to falter. This does not always appear as an explosion or a dramatic rupture. Sometimes it emerges as a quiet but irreversible shift, a refusal to continue as before, a clarity that cannot be undone. What has been suppressed does not return in its original form, it returns transformed, carrying the weight of everything that has been denied. What was once hidden begins to redefine the surface, altering perception, behavior, and identity in ways that cannot be easily reversed. As the accumulated force of the unexpressed moves toward expression with a persistence that no longer yields to suppression, leaving was an act of becoming whole, not a reaction born out of impulse, but the result of a long internal process that had been unfolding beyond immediate visibility. What appears, from the outside, as a decision made in a single moment, is often the culmination of countless moments of reflection, tension, and gradual realization. The act of leaving is rarely about escape. It is about alignment, about bringing one's external life into coherence with an internal truth that can no longer remain divided. For a long time, there exists a fragmentation within the self. One part adapts, conforms, fulfills expectations, and maintains stability. Another part observes, questions, and resists quietly, holding on to something that does not fully belong to the roles being performed. These parts coexist, often without direct conflict at first, The individual learns to navigate between them, presenting what is required while containing what does not fit. This division becomes normalized, even necessary, for maintaining relationships and structures that depend on consistency. But fragmentation carries a cost. The more one part is emphasized at the expense of another, the more pronounced the imbalance becomes. What is suppressed does not disappear. It continues to exist, influencing perception, shaping reactions, and creating a subtle but persistent sense of dissonance. This dissonance is not always immediately identifiable, but it manifests as unease, as a feeling that something essential is being neglected or compromised. Over time, this inner division becomes harder to sustain. The effort required to maintain the separation increases, and the distance between the external self and the internal truth grows more apparent. Moments of clarity begin to emerge, instances where the individual recognizes the extent of the compromise being made. These moments are often brief, but they leave an impression, gradually altering the way one interprets their own experience. Leaving, in this context, is not an act of rejection directed outward, but a movement inward. It is the point at which the individual ceases to prioritize external expectations over internal coherence. The roles that once defined identity begin to lose their authority, not because they are inherently false, but because they no longer encompass the entirety of what the individual has come to understand about themselves. This shift does not occur without resistance. There is often a strong pull to remain within what is familiar, to preserve what has already been established. The fear of disruption, of uncertainty, of being misunderstood, can delay the process, extending the period of fragmentation. Yet the awareness once formed does not disappear. It continues to exert influence, making it increasingly difficult to ignore the discrepancy between what is lived and what is true. As this awareness deepens, the idea of leaving transforms. It is no longer perceived as loss, but as necessity. Not leaving becomes the greater risk, as it would require a continued division of the self that can no longer be justified. The act itself may appear simple, stepping away, withdrawing, changing direction, but internally it represents a profound reorganization. It is the moment where the divided aspects of the self are no longer held apart, where what has been suppressed is allowed to stand alongside what has been expressed, forming a more complete and integrated identity that no longer sustains itself through separation. Your transformation broke their illusion of control, not because you directly opposed them, but because you quietly stepped outside the framework that allowed them to predict you. Control, in its subtle form, does not always appear as force or domination. It often exists as expectation, as familiarity, as a pattern of behavior that becomes so consistent it no longer needs to be enforced. They did not feel the need to control you actively, because they believed they already understood you well enough to anticipate your choices. This belief created a structure in which your responses became part of their certainty. They learned what you would tolerate, how you would react, where your limits seemed to lie, and where they appeared absent. Over time, these observations solidified into assumptions. They no longer questioned whether those assumptions were accurate, because they had been reinforced repeatedly. Your predictability became their stability, and within that stability, they found a sense of control that felt natural rather than imposed. But predictability is not the same as truth. It is often the result of repetition, of circumstances that remain unchanged long enough to create the appearance of permanence. When those circumstances begin to shift, even internally, the patterns built upon them start to lose their reliability. Your transformation did not occur in a way that immediately disrupted these patterns. At first, it was internal, altering your perception rather than your behavior. You still moved within the same structures, still responded in familiar ways, but the meaning behind those responses was beginning to change. This is where the illusion deepened. Because your external actions had not yet diverged significantly, they interpreted your continuity as confirmation. They believed nothing had changed, reinforcing their confidence in their understanding of you. Meanwhile, your internal landscape was reorganizing. What you once accepted without question began to feel conditional. What you once tolerated began to register as a choice rather than an obligation. As this shift progressed, small deviations began to appear. Perhaps they were subtle at first, a hesitation where there was once immediate compliance, a question where there was once agreement, a boundary where there was once openness. These changes may have seemed insignificant in isolation, but they represented a larger transformation. Each deviation introduced uncertainty into a system that had relied on consistency. Uncertainty challenges control. It disrupts the ability to predict, to assume, to rely on past patterns as indicators of future behavior. As your transformation became more visible, their sense of certainty began to weaken. They could no longer rely on the same expectations, because those expectations were no longer being met in the same way. What had once felt stable began to feel unpredictable. This unpredictability was not chaos, it was autonomy. It was the emergence of a self that no longer aligned with the constraints that had once defined it. From their perspective, this shift may have seemed sudden or unjustified, but in reality, it was the result of a long process that had simply gone unnoticed. The illusion of control depends on the assumption that the other person will remain consistent in ways that serve that control. And when that consistency dissolves, what is revealed is not the loss of something real, but the collapse of a belief that was never fully grounded in the evolving reality of who you were becoming. You were never meant to remain who they needed you to be, because what they needed was not a reflection of your full nature, but a simplified version that could fit within their understanding. Human relationships often begin with perception rather than truth. People see what they are capable of seeing, and from that limited view, they form expectations. These expectations are not inherently malicious. They are constructed from familiarity, from comfort, from the desire for stability. But over time, they begin to define the boundaries within which you are allowed to exist. To meet these expectations, you adapt. You emphasize certain aspects of yourself while minimizing others. You learn which parts of you are welcomed and which create friction. This adaptation can feel natural at first, even necessary, as it allows for connection and belonging. But what is often overlooked is that this process is selective. It does not accommodate the entirety of who you are. It prioritizes what is acceptable, what is useful, what aligns with the needs of others. As this pattern continues, a subtle distortion emerges. The version of you that exists in their perception becomes more stable than the reality of who you are. They begin to relate to that version as if it were complete, unaware of the aspects that remain unexpressed. Over time, this perceived identity gains authority. It becomes the standard against which your actions are measured, the framework within which your behavior is interpreted. But the self is not static. It is not confined to the roles it performs or the expectations it fulfills. Beneath the adapted exterior, there remains a complexity that cannot be fully contained. There are contradictions, desires, and potentials that do not align with the established image. These elements do not disappear simply because they are not expressed. They persist, influencing your inner experience, shaping your sense of authenticity. The longer this division is maintained, the more apparent it becomes. What once felt like adaptation begins to feel like limitation. The boundaries that once provided structure begin to feel restrictive. You start to recognize the difference between who you are in relation to others and who you are in yourself. This recognition is not always immediate or comfortable, but it introduces a question that cannot easily be dismissed: whether the version of you that is being maintained is truly sufficient. They continue to engage with the identity they have come to expect, often reinforcing it through their reactions and assumptions. Each time you conform, the expectation is strengthened. Each time you deviate, it is questioned or corrected. This dynamic creates pressure to remain consistent, to preserve the version of yourself that has been accepted. But consistency, when it conflicts with authenticity, becomes a form of constraint rather than stability. What they needed was continuity, reliability, a version of you that would not disrupt their understanding. But what you required was expansion, integration, the freedom to move beyond what had been defined for you. These two forces cannot remain aligned indefinitely. One demands preservation, the other demands change, and as the need for authenticity grows stronger, the ability to remain within those imposed boundaries begins to diminish, making it increasingly clear that you were never meant to remain confined to a role that only represented a fraction of who you are.